In Python, a list is one of the data types known as a sequence, and that is a group of elements that can be bound together and worked on as one large variable. Now, there's actually multiple types of sequences, and a list is one of the most commonly used because of its flexibility. However, there's one called a tuple, which looks very similar to a list. In fact, when you create one, as we've seen here, if you look at it too quickly, you might mistake it for a list. The biggest difference in creating one is that here I'm using parentheses instead of square brackets. So what's the difference between a tuple and a list? Well, a list, if you remember correctly, allows you to change the elements, both the individual elements as well as adding to and removing elements from the list. A tuple is not mutable, meaning that it cannot do any of those things. Once you create a tuple, that is it. It will not let you reverse them, sort them, add to them, etc. So why would you use a tuple? Well, it's actually much faster and less memory intensive than a list because it doesn't have all those other abilities. So if I need to just use a set of values and I know it's not going to change, using it as a tuple is a great tool. Let's look at running this tuple just to see what it looks like. In this case, I've just created the tuple. I want to print it out. And you'll notice that it looks and prints almost exactly the same as a list. Once again, the only difference is if I print out my whole tuple is that I put in parentheses in the printout instead of square brackets. So let's look at how we could individually access these elements. Just as with a list, tuples can also store strings. Here's an example of names, and we can iterate over each individual element. Here you'll see that we have a for loop. Now, you might look at it and go, wait a second, does names look really familiar? Well, a common practice is to use a plural version for storing a list or a tuple or other sequence of events that's going to hold multiple items, in this case, names. And then when I'm dealing with an individual element, I use a singular, name. So I say for name in names. So I'm talking about a specific name as I iterate over my tuple of names. And then I print that out. If I run this tuple, you'll notice that it prints each individual name on a separate line, just as you would expect if I was using a list or printing out 4 separate names. Now, finally, every once in a while, and it's not common, but there is the need occasionally to convert a tuple to a list or convert a list to a tuple. And here we see in our first section, we have a set of tuples, and then I create a number list from my number tuple. It's real simple to do. All I use is the list command, and I pass in the tuple, and that will create a list for me. Likewise, in my second section, I have a list, and I use the tuple command to pass in the list, and it will convert it to a tuple. So it's a pretty simple thing to do, not needed real often, but it's possible. And that's a quick overview of how you use tuples in Python.